Don Cossacks are Cossacks who settled along the Middle and Lower Don. Historically, they have been located within what was the Don Cossack Host, which was either an independent or an autonomous democratic republic in the present-day southern Russia and the Donbas region of Ukraine, for the end of the 16th century until 1918. As of 1992, by the presidential decree of the Russian Federation, Cossacks can be enrolled on a special register. A number of Cossack communities have been reconstituted to further the Cossack cultural traditions, including those of the Don Cossack Host. Don Cossacks have had a rich military tradition, playing an important part in the historical development of the Russian Empire and participating in most of its major wars. Etymology and origins. The name Cossack was widely used to describe free people as opposed to others with different standing in a feudal society. The word Cossack was also applied to migrants, freebooters and bandits. The exact origins of Cossacks are unknown. In modern view, Don Cossacks are descendants of Slavic people who came from the Dnieper Novgorod Republic and Principality of Ryazan, and of Goth Salons people originating from the western part of North Caucasus. History. Early history. More than 2,000 years ago, the Scythians lived on the banks of the river Don. Many Scythian tombs have been found in this area. Subsequently, the area was inhabited by the Khazars and the Polovtians. The steppes of the Don River were called the Wild Field. The area was under the general control of the Golden Horde, and numerous Tatar armed groups roamed there, attacking Russian and foreign merchants. The first Christians to settle on the territories around the Don were the Jassi and Kosogi tribes. After the fall of the Golden Horde in 1480, more Russian colonists started to expand onto this land from the Novgorod Republic after the Battle of Shelin and from neighboring Principality of Ryazan. Until the end of the 16th century, the Don Cossacks inhabited independent free territories. 15th–17th centuries, Cossacks of Ryazan are mentioned in 1444 as the defenders of Peroslavl-Zaleski against the units of Golden Horde and in a letter of Ivan III of Russia since 1502. After the Golden Horde fell in 1480, the area around the Don River was divided between the Crimean west side and the Nogai east side. On the border since the 14th century, the vast steppe of the Don region was populated by those people who were not satisfied with the existing social order, by those who did not recognize the power of the landowners, by runaway serfs, by those who longed for freedom. In the course of time, they turned into a united community and were called the Cossacks. At first, the main occupation of these small armed detachments was hunting and fishing, as well as the constant struggle against the Turks and the Tartars who attacked them. Only later they began to settle and work on the land. 16th century. The first records relating to the Cossack villages, the Stanitsa, date back to 1549. In the year 1552, Don Cossacks under the command of Ataman Susar Fedov joined the army of Ivan the Terrible during the siege of Kazan in 1552. On the 2nd of June 1556, the Cossack regiment of Ataman Lyapun Philomenov, together with the army of Moscovites comprising Strelets, conquered and annexed the Astrakhan Khanate. During the reign of Ivan the Terrible, the Ataman Yermak Timofeyevich went on an expedition to conquer Siberia. After defeating Khan Kuchim in the fall of 1582 and occupying Iska, the capital of the Siberian Khanate, Yermak sent a force of Cossacks down the Irtysh in the winter of 1583. The detachment, led by Bogdan Bryazga, passed through the lands of the Kondapelim Vogels and reached the walls of the town of Samarovo. Taken by surprise by the Cossack attack, the Ostyaks surrendered. In fall 1585, shortly after Yermak's death, Cossacks led by Voivode Ivan Manchurov founded the first Russian fortified town in Siberia, Obskoy, at the mouth of the Irtysh River on the right bank of the Ob River. The Mansi and Khanty lands thus became part of the Russian state, finally secured by the founding of the cities of Pelin-Berezov in 1592 and Surgut in 1594. As a result of Yermak's expedition, Russia was able to annex Siberia, 17th century. During the Polish-Muscovite War, the Polish-Lithuanian noble Alexander Joseph Lisowski founded a cavalry mercenary group from various outlaws, partly Don Cossacks. This group served under the Polish crown. After the war with Muscovites, Lisowski took part in the Moldavian Magnate Wars at Upper Hungary. Later they plundered Silesia and Moravia as allies of Habsburg armies in the Bohemian Revolt, first phase of 30 Years' War. This phase culminated in the Battle of White Mountain in November 8, 1620, where the Lisowski were sent by Johann Siklaus, Count of Tilly against Hungarian cavalry. They were victorious, capturing 20 standards. After the battle, they terrorized village people around Prague and other cities, so they were expeditiously paid and released from service in May 7, 1621. Some returned to Poland, others served under Habsburg Maximilian I, Elector of Bavaria. Under Peter the Great and subsequent rulers, the Don Cossacks participated in numerous military campaigns, which resulted in the expansion of the Russian Empire from the Black Sea to the Baltic Sea. For years, the Cossacks waged war against the Ottomans and the Crimean Khanate. The siege of Azov in 1641 was one of the key actions in Don Cossack history. After total taking of the free territories of Don Cossacks under the Moscovites' control, Don Cossack history is totally intertwined with the history of the rest of Russia. In exchange for protection of the southern borders of medieval Russia, the Don Cossacks were given the privilege of not paying taxes, and the Tsar's authority in Cossack lands was not as absolute as in other parts of Russia. During this period, three of Russia's most notorious rebels, Stenka Razin, Kondraty Bulivin and Emelian Pugachev, were Don Cossacks. 18th, 19th centuries. After 1786, the territory of the Don Cossacks was officially called Don Voisko lands, and was renamed Don Voisko province in 1870. In 1805 the Don Cossack capital was shifted from Cherkassk to Novokirkassk. Don Cossacks are credited with playing a significant part in repelling Napoleon's invasion of Russia. Under the command of Count Matvey Ivanovich Platov, the Don Cossacks fought in a number of battles against the Grande Armée Qt. In the Battle of Borodino, Don Cossacks made raids to the rear of the French army. Platov commanded all the Cossack troops and successfully covered the retreat of the Russian army to Moscow. The Don Cossacks distinguished themselves in subsequent campaigns, and took part in the capture of Paris. Napoleon is credited with declaring, "Cossacks are the finest light troops among all that exist. If I had them in my army, I would go through all the world with them." In the general census of 1884, the male population of the Don Cossacks was reported to number 425,000. The Don Cossacks were the largest of the 10 Cossack hosts then in existence, providing over a third of total Cossack manpower available for military service. 20th century World War I. On the eve of World War I, the Don Cossack Host comprised 17 regular regiments plus 6 detached sotnias. In addition, 2 regiments of the Imperial Guard were recruited from the Don territory. By 1916 the Don host had expanded to 58 line regiments and 100 detached sotnias. The central location of the Don territories meant that these units were employed extensively on both the German and Austro-Hungarian fronts, though less so against the Ottoman Turks to the south. The continued value of the Don and other Cossacks as mounted troops was illustrated by the decision taken in 1916 to dismount about a third of the regular Russian cavalry, but to retain the Cossack regiments in the traditional role. February 1917 Revolution. At the outbreak of the February 1917 Revolution, 3 regiments of Don Cossacks formed part of the garrison of St. Petersburg, consisting partly of new recruits from the poorer regions of the host territory. These units were influenced by the general disillusionment with the Tsar's government. Accordingly, they did not act effectively when ordered to disperse the growing demonstrations in the city. Reports that the historically loyal Don Cossacks could no longer be relied on were a significant factor in the sudden collapse of the Tsarist regime. Bolshevik persecution. The Don Cossack Host was disbanded on Russian soil in 1918 after the Russian Revolution, but the Don Cossacks in the White Army and those who emigrated abroad continued to preserve the traditions, musical and otherwise, of the host. Many found employment as trick riders in various circuses throughout Europe and the United States. Admiral Alexander Vasilyevich Kolchak, one of the leaders of the White movement during the Russian Civil War, was of Don Cossack descent. Following the defeat of the White Army in the Russian Civil War, a policy of de-Cossacization took place on the surviving Cossacks and the homelands, since they were viewed as a threat to the new Soviet regime. The Cossack homelands were often very fertile, and during the collectivization campaign many Cossacks shared the fate of the kulaks. According to historian Michael Court, during 1919 and 1920, out of a population of approximately 1.5 million Don Cossacks, the Bolshevik regime killed or deported an estimated 300,000 to 500,000. The region also suffered greatly during the Soviet famine of 1932–33 as a result of the Soviet policies. Don Cossacks in World War II. On the 20th of April 1936, the previous ban on Cossacks serving in the Red Army was lifted. Later the same year, 2 existing Red Army cavalry divisions were redesignated as Don Cossacks. By 1939, a number of these regiments had been issued with traditional Cossack uniforms in ceremonial and field service versions. The dress of the Don Cossack units included the broad red stripes on dark blue breeches, which had been the distinguishing feature prior to the revolution. The Don Cossack Cavalry Corps saw extensive active service until 1943, after which its role diminished. However, Don Cossack Cavalry was still in existence in 1945 and participated in the Victory Parade in Moscow. During World War II, the Don Cossacks mustered the largest single concentration of Cossacks within the German army, the 15th SS Cossack Cavalry Corps. A great part of the Cossacks were former Russian citizens who elected to fight not so much for Germany as against the Soviet Union. The 15th SS Cossack Cavalry Corps included the 1st Cossack Division and the 2nd Cossack Division. 21st century modern Don Cossacks. Today the Russian state is very different. Between 1917 and 1941, more than half of the Don Cossacks' population were killed or deported. The heirs of those deported during the Soviet terror cannot return to their homeland. This is because the law of restitution does not recognize them as victims of communism. The pro-governmental host divided in 2 different organizations. The Don Cossacks were revived in the early 1990s and were officially recognized by the Russian Federation government in 1997. In 1992 they joined the separatists' forces during the Transnistria War. There still exist several organizations of anti-communist Cossacks outside Russia. The most known is the Almighty Don Host outside Russia, formerly under Chief Major General and last Chevalier of the Order of St. George, Ataman Nikolai Vasilievich Fedorov, and since February 2006 under J.L. Maya. Since 2014, an unknown number of Don Cossacks have participated in the war in eastern Ukraine as independent volunteers. Reportedly several military formations were formed, though most of these groups were subsequently disbanded and integrated into the armed forces of the DPR and LPR. National symbols of Don Cossacks. Flag of Don Cossacks. The Don Cossacks flag 3-4 was inaugurated during the Don Cossacks Assembly in Novokaukask, Don Republic, on 4 May 1918 under chiefing of Ataman Pyotr Krasnov. The flag has the colors blue, yellow, and red. The flag is similar to that of the Ukrainian state, also established in 1918, which the Don Republic bordered to its west. Coat of arms. The Don Cossacks' coat of arms was known from the 17th century. It was adopted as a symbol of the Don Republic on 15 September 1918. Uniform. Until 1914 the distinguishing color of the Don Cossack Host was red, worn on the cap bands and wide trouser stripes of a dark blue uniform of the loose-fitting cut common to the steppe Cossacks. Tall lambskin hats were worn on occasion, with red cloth tops. Shoulder straps were the same dark blue as the kaftan. A whip was used instead of spurs. Prior to 1908, individual Cossacks from all hosts were required to provide their own uniforms. However, the size and relative affluence of the Don Cossack Host permitted the setting up of communally owned clothing factories. A khaki field tunic was adopted in 1908, replacing the dark blue coats or white blouses previously worn for ordinary duties. However, the blue riding breeches with broad red stripes, long characteristic of the Don Host, continued to be worn even on active service during both World Wars. Anthem of Don Cossacks. Written by Fedor Anisimov in 1853. Religion. Most Don Cossacks are Russian Orthodox who consider themselves guardians of the faith. However, a large percentage of Don Cossacks were Starouvers. Even in 1903, a minimum of 150,000 from a total of the 2,500,000 parish members of the Don Eparchy were Starouvers. Atman Count Matvey Platov was of a Popovtsy Old Believers family. Don Cossacks were tolerant of other religions with the exception of Jews and accepted Buddhists, Muslims, Old Believers, and pagans into the communities. Traditions and culture. The Cossacks had a democratic society where the most important decisions were made during a common assembly. The assembly elected temporary authorities, atamans. Don Cossacks were skilled horsemen and experienced warriors. Due to the long conflict with the Crimean Khanate and the Ottoman Empire, they sold the military services to different powers in Eastern Europe. Together with the Polish king, they raided Moscow during the time of troubles and, under Russian authority, carried out raids and expeditions against Ottoman Turkey and Kayar Persia. Isolated between Russian and Muslim territory, the Don Cossacks developed a distinct culture and language which fused Ukrainian, Russian, Kamic, and Tatar elements. The Don Cossacks have a tradition of choral singing and many of the songs, such as Kyorny Voron and Lyubo Bratsi, Lyubo became popular throughout the rest of Russia. Many of the songs are about death in war. Up to the 18th century, marriages and divorces were held in the common assembly. If a Cossack wanted to marry a woman, he was expected to bring her to the common assembly for presentation. If the common assembly gave approval, the marriage followed. The same procedure took place if there was a divorce. Peter I banned these practices in the Common Assembly, requiring Cossacks to marry only in church. A Cossack marriage is a complex ritual, accompanied by songs, dances and performances. A bridegroom arrives on horseback and takes his bride to the church, followed by a marriage train. After the wedding, all present would adjourn to the bridegroom's house. There, the parents would bless the couple, break a loaf of bread above their heads, and sprinkle them with wheat, nuts, sweets and hops. The bride's hair would then be unbraided according to traditional rites. When a son was born to a Cossack family, his relatives presented him with an arrow, a bow, a cartridge, a bullet and a gun. All of these items were hung on the wall over the boy's bed. At the age of 3, the boy began to ride a horse. At the age of 7 to 8, he was allowed to ride in the street, to go fishing and hunt with grown-ups. Horse racing was a popular pastime with Don Cossacks. Riders competed to hit a target, firing weapons from horseback. The most dexterous were able to do this standing on the horse's back. It was traditional practice for Cossack families to provide a young Cossack with 2 horses, a uniform and weapons. Cossack leave-taking was always festive. All departing Cossacks would gather in the church, then hang a small bag around their necks containing a pinch of the native soil before setting off singing. Having left the stanitsa, they drank a cup of vodka and said goodbye to the native land. Don Cossack Host. The Don Cossack Host was a group of former officers of the Russian Imperial Army who were discovered singing in Silingia, where they had fled after the defeat of their army in the Crimea. They made the formal concert debut in Vienna in 1923, led by the founder, conductor and composer, Serge Gerov. The choir became popular in America, Japan and Europe, touring the world in the 1930s, 40s and 50s, till today. The men, dressed as Cossacks, sang a cappella in a repertory of Russian sacred and secular music, army, folk and art songs. Cossack dancing was eventually added to the program. In popular culture, Mikhail Sholokov's monumental work, Unquiet Flows the Don, deals sympathetically with the Don Cossacks and depicts the destruction of the way of life as a result of World War I and the Russian Civil War.